Hi friends, welcome to the Share, Invite, and Proclaim channel. My name is Judy. I hope I can get through this today. My family's been sick and I've had COVID, and so we'll just continue on, and maybe I'll get through with Hebrews by the end of the school year. But excuse me for all of the congestion. It's been raining for 3 or 4 days, and it just is not going to go away until it dries up a little bit. Well, we've been in this study of Hebrews about Jesus being superior to angels in chapters 1 and 2, Jesus being superior to Moses in chapter 3, Jesus being the provider of God's rest in chapter 4, and Jesus is our high priest and superior to the Levitical line of priests. And Jesus provides a superior hope in face of believers' conflicts and apostasy in chapter 6 and part of chapter 10. And then Jesus provides a superior covenant with God, chapter 7, verses 22 to 28, in chapters 8 and 9, and part of 10. And then we have a superior life of faith in chapter 11 by Old Testament witnesses. And that is the one that's taking forever. I've already talked about, some of those Old Testament witnesses: Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, Rahab. And so now we're at that point where we're to the judges. And we'll talk about the judges. And I'm going to go a little bit more in depth about the judges, not just the ones that the Hebrew writer talked about, because some of the others I think were pretty good in terms of keeping peace. So we want to go to the superior life of faith by the judges. And tradition has it that Samuel wrote the Judges anywhere from 1380 BC to 1050 BC. So, at least 1,000 or more years before Christ, in the late Bronze Age. Well, what is the purpose of the Judges? In chapter 2, verse 7, it tells us the Israelites served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the elders and those who saw God's mighty works. But a whole generation grew up. This next generation did not know the God of Israel, nor the things that he had done for Israel. They failed to educate the next generation, and it caused problems. I wonder if we here in 2023, if we have educated the next generation on the mighty works of God. If not, our country will fall. Well, when the Israelites turned their hearts to follow evil practices of the pagan people around them, God allowed raiders to plunder them. And then when Israel became oppressed, realized their sin, and confessed their sin, God would have compassion on them and raise up a judge who would save them out of the hands of the raiders. But when the judge God raised up died, then the Israelites would return to their evil ways. And one of the problems was that these tribal leaders did not drive out the Canaanites, but lived among them and eventually adopted their lifestyle, their way of life, and their gods. Moses had told them to eliminate them, and they refused to do that. There are 6 major judges and 6 minor judges, and I'm not sure what determines the difference other than maybe Bible time, because we have some that have only one verse and others that have an entire chapter or more. Maybe it was their popularity. I'm not real sure. But some of them were selected by God. I don't know how the others were selected. But the first one was in chapter 3, verses 7 to 11, Othniel. Othniel was the brother of Caleb, and he ruled as the judge and saved them in peace for 40 years. That's a typical age of a generation. Then the next one, Ehud. Ehud had a time where Israel was attacked by the Moabs, the Ammonites, the Amalekites. And Israel was subject to the king of Moab for 18 years. But Ehud was a Benjamite, and he was called, Scripture tells us he was a left-handed man. Now that's significant because he tricked Eglon into sending his army away, and he spoke privately with this king. And because he was left-handed, he could hide his sword in the right hand part of his robe, or his robe, let's just call it that. And so when he was there, he could pull out the sword and killed Eglon. Ehud returned to Ephraim. He blew trumpets. Israel killed 10,000 Moabites, and the rest were subject to Israel for 80 years. Excuse me. Now, this reminds me a little bit of Joshua blowing trumpets around the walls of Jericho. Well, after Ehud died, there was a minor judge, Shamgar, and he only had one verse, but it said that he killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. That's a long wooden rod with a metal tip. And he saved Israel, but we don't know how long he was a judge. But we do know, Scripture says that the roads were unsafe, and many left their villages and went to the walled cities for safety in chapter 5, verses 6 to 8. After Shamgar, Israel did evil in God's eyes, and that's why the roads were unsafe. And eventually, Jabin, the king of the Canaanites, he ruled over Israel for 20 years. And they had 900 iron chariots. They were in the Bronze Age. And Jabin's military commander was Sisera. And Deborah was a judge in Ephraim, and she was a prophetess, a spokeswoman for God. Now, whether or not the people listened to a prophet or a prophetess, they spoke a word from the Lord. And so Deborah told Israel's military commander, Barak, to take 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun and rout Sisera at Mount Tabor. Now, I always have to know where these things are because it makes it real to me. So here we have Ephraim, where Deborah was from, and she called for help from Zebulun and Asher and Naphtali as tribes to help them, and they were to meet the Canaanite warrior at Mount Tabor, which is right here, Mount Tabor. Well, even though Deborah had Barak to take 10,000 men from these tribes and go to and capture Sisera at Mount Tabor, he said that he wouldn't go unless Deborah went with him. And he wouldn't go if Deborah didn't go with him, but he would go if Deborah went with him. I think I got that right. Anyway, Deborah said that she would go, but because of his lack of faith, for not going into battle, he was a great general by himself. She said that the victory for this would go to a woman, and that woman was Jair, and she had hid Sisera in her tent and covered him up, and then when he went to sleep, she drove a tent peg tent peg through his head. And Sisera had his chariots go to the valley of Jezreel along the Kishon River. Now, let me show you where that is, because this is an interesting thing that God kind of does. All right, here's the valley of Jezreel, and here's the Kishon River. And so Sisera told his army before he died to go to this area, the valley of Jezreel. Well, guess what God did? He brought a flood. And those 900 chariots got caught in the mud and couldn't move. And so they were ripe pickings for Barak and Deborah, and they were able to help take away this crisis. The other tribes were rebuked because they didn't send military help. But after this victory, Israel had peace for 40 years, a generation. So I'm always confused. Why does the writer of Hebrews talk about the faith of Barak rather than Deborah or Jair? I don't know, other than he was a Jewish Christian and the men had to get the glory, I guess. I don't know. Barak was a faithful commander, a good soldier, but he needed the encouragement of Deborah. And I think that's, I guess, what many faithful women do, is they're encouragers to those that are called to do something. When Deborah died, Israel again did evil in God's eyes. The Midianites ravaged the land. They caused Israel to run into cliffs and caves and strongholds in walled cities. But God sent an unnamed prophet to tell Israel that they had forgotten God. And they were worshiping these other gods, so ask them for help. Some of the humor of God. He said, if they're so powerful, let them save you. Well, God selected Gideon to fight these Midianites. Gideon was shocked because he was the least of his tribe, and his tribe was the least of those of the 12 tribes. But God told him not to be afraid, that he would not die. Have peace, he said. So Gideon built an altar to God and named it "The Lord is Peace." And that shows you the type of superior faith that we're looking for. And Gideon's name means one who cuts down the enemy. The enemy camped again along the valley of Jezreel, and Gideon blew trumpets for the Israelite tribes to follow him. And sometimes in scripture, his name is called Zerubbabel. But anyway, God began to decrease the size of his army so that Israel would not brag that in their own strength they were able to defeat the enemy. So God told him that if anybody is afraid, send him home. 22,000 men were afraid, and they went home. And the Lord said, well, there's still too many. So his next step was to go down to the water, the spring of Ehud, and separate those men who lacked water with their hands, who were, had one eye on possible invasion or attack by the enemy, and those who just, dipped their head in the water. Again, this valley of Jezreel right here. So 300 lapped. So Gideon sent 9,700 men home. The Lord told Gideon to go down to the Midian camp, where the Amalekites and all the other eastern peoples, it says, was thick as locusts. This reminds me of the one of the plagues in Egypt. Gideon went down on the second watch, and his servant went with him. He went to the camp and overheard a dream. Now, oopsie, here we go. So Gideon was at this area here, and he was to go to the hill of Moriah, right up here. He went to the camp in the night, and he overheard a midnight person speaking about a dream he had, and then a person who interprets that dream. And the dream was that a loaf of barley bread tumbled into their camp and overturned a tent. And the interpreter said that that loaf was Gideon, and that the tent overturning was that God had given the midnight camp into Gideon's hands. Interesting, we don't know how they knew about Gideon, but God gave them that message. And that encouraged Gideon. So he divided his 300 men into 3 different groups, and they surrounded the Midianite camp. And the Midianites had about 120,000 men. Here was the battle plan, so typical of God. He told Gideon to blow the trumpets, smash their empty jars with torches inside, and shout, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." And the Lord caused many men of the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The men of Ephraim captured and killed 2 military leaders and brought their heads to Gideon. You know, that was a kind of custom in their day. Yeah. Now, Gideon and his men chased after those who were still running from Gideon, and they chased him from up here across the Jordan River to 2 towns. Zephon, I think it's Zephon. Let me check, make sure. Zephon. Is it Zephon? Succoth? Oh, it's Succoth. I'm sorry. Succoth, which is right about here, and Penuel. Succoth and Penuel. And in each of these little tiny towns, Gideon asked if the people would give his men some bread, because they were exhausted, famished. And each of the leaders of both of these towns said no. They didn't have faith that Gideon, number one, was called by God to do this, and that two, that he would be successful. So they refused. So Gideon continued to chase this army of Midianites, and they finally were able to capture the army. And Gideon brought these 2 kings, Zebul and Zalmunna, these 2 Midianite kings, and brought them back to Succoth and Penuel to show these cities the strength of God. And they wanted to make him king, but he said, no, God rules over us. And so Gideon and his success gave them peace for 40 years. But during this time, they failed to show kindness to Gideon and his family and the good things that he had done. So one of Gideon's sons, and he had 70 because he had many wives and concubines, his son Abimelech ruled, and eventually he kills 69 of these other 70 sons of Gideon, and the one who survived was Jotham. Now, Abimelech was not a judge. He was a tyrant. Some of the kinds of things that he would do is that the people in Shechem ran to a tower. Let's show you where Shechem is. Shechem, where are you? Shechem. Right here, Shechem. They ran to a tower And Abimelech burned the tower down and killed about 1,000 Jewish people. He was a tyrant. And he stormed another tower. But a woman, which is not widely known, a woman threw a millstone, one of those big millstones, down on his head, cracked his skull. But Abimelech ordered his armor bearer to kill him because he didn't want it to be known that he was killed by a woman. Well, the next judge was Tola of Shamgar in Ephraim, and he ruled as a judge for 23 years. And this judge had 2 verses of Bible time. When Tola died, he was followed by Jair, who served for 22 years. He gets 3 verses. Now, the next judge is Jephthah, and I can't pronounce his name, but we'll save that for part 2, because there are a lot of judges that I want to talk about, and a summary. So stay tuned for part 2.